Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah, salatu salamu ala rasulillah, ma ba'd. Good morning, and thank you so much for this opportunity. I wish to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land upon which we stand. And I want to also begin by saying that I am a Muslim academic who does not examine Muslims as an object of study inscribed by otherness. I share their pain and joy, and I see what they see and hear what they hear. I mix and mingle with them, with their young and old, with their men and women, with the devout among them and those who are not so devout. I pray at their mosques. I attend their weddings. I work very closely with their young and old, and attend meetings at odd hours of the day and night at a regular basis, on a regular basis. Therefore, I speak to you this morning as an insider who wishes to share the sentiments of a besieged community. Despite having spent billions on counterterrorism measures, the 2015 review of Australia's counterterrorism machinery report concludes the following. All of the terrorism-related metrics are worsening. Known numbers of foreign fighters, sympathizers and supporters, serious investigators, and they say we are not winning on any front. The review also concluded that the community is a key to the long-term solution. The importance of the community's cooperation in mitigating the risks of terrorism was also recognized by the Australian government counter-terrorism paper, stating that the community is a crucial partner in protecting Australia from terrorism and a valuable source of information regarding terrorist-related activities. I mean, for me, this is a no-brainer. I don't need a white paper to tell me this. And our community doesn't need that. We don't need that paper to tell us that. However, given this conclusion, it makes sense not to demonize the Muslim community, not to marginalize the Muslim community, not to discriminate against them and humiliate them. It makes sense to work with them and not against them. It makes sense to include them and not exclude them from discussions and debates and the processes that relate to them and their communities. The failure to work intelligently and effectively, I'm not saying they don't work, there is plenty of work taking place, but perhaps it is not intelligent nor effective, and because of that, it has generated not only a sense of being under siege, as our dear colleague Adrian Cherney, who's sitting with us, concluded in his report, but also Muslim hostility towards counterterrorism policing and laws. The consequences is that this can engender a general unwillingness to cooperate with authorities in efforts to address terrorism and radicalization. There has been extensive discussions in the last 24 hours on the causes of radicalization. Our own research and what has been discussed yesterday demonstrates there are the problem is multifaceted. It is not appropriate, perhaps, to speak of a single factor that leads to violent extremism. We must not simplify the argument and say Islamophobia on its own leads to violent extremism. But all the academic research shows that perhaps extremist ideologies, extremist Muslim figures, perceived scholarly authority, transitional regional religious experience, the Muslim identification, empathy and altruism, association with radicals, Western relations with and policies regarding the Muslim world, psychological factors, disproportionate counter-terrorism measures, media reporting, and much more. We should not therefore fall in a reductionist conclusion to say one cause or one factor is the problem, but perhaps we should speak of a theory of interconnectedness of causes, where one cause alone is not necessarily sufficient to trigger violent extremism. And as we have heard yesterday, Professor Esposito reminding us, unless we treat the root causes, such as the injustices in the Middle East, double standards of Western foreign policies, the Palestinian plight, then terrorism and violent extremism will raise its ugly head again, even if groups such as ISIS are destroyed. What must we do locally? What is the sentiment of the community? First, they believe that it must be recognized that Islam is not the problem, but it is a solution to the problem. This is not what some of our politicians and media want to hear. But we must say it again and again, as we have done for the last 2 decades. Just yesterday, a number of our politicians repeated the argument that Islam is the problem, and that Islam needs to change, and that Islam needs to reform. We were reminded yesterday by a few experts that this is exactly the narrative that ISIS wants to hear, because it legitimizes their claim that the West is against Islam. Last month, Professor Sayyid Hussein Nasr stated the best way to counter extremism in modern Islam is a revival of classical Islam. There needs to be a recognition that classical Islam was and is against all forms of extremism, and not its leading cause. The failure to interpret the text in context, or twisted interpretations for whatever reason, egoistic interpretations, and so forth, can lead to extremist interpretations and acts. And I don't need to remind you that this is not peculiar to Islamic scripture. In fact, the existence of an extremist and puritanical manifestation is not new in Islamic history. In the 1st century, you saw the emergence of the Khawarij, who exhibited similar tendencies as ISIS did today. But interestingly, the descendants of the Khawarij exist today in Oman and Algeria, but after centuries, they have become moderates, if not pacifists. Other extremist groups, such as the Hashashin or the Assassins, also existed at some point in time, and their descendants learned moderation and continue to live in Iraq and North Africa in small numbers. Why is that the case? Historically, violent extremism has always been seen as an aberration and an exception to normative Islam. And the lesson learned from Islamic history is that extremist groups are rejected from mainstream Islam. They are marginalized and become known as heretical aberration to the Islamic message. In fact, one of the most important reasons for this is the influence of classical Islamic institutions and credible scholarship that acted to marginalize extremist creeds and ideologies. And this is an important point to remember, and any attempt at combating violent extremism must recognize that it is Muslim scholars versed in the sacred text who are able to refute extremist ideologies and delegitimize it religiously. Yes, this alone cannot solve the problem of violent extremism in the name of Islam, but it can help diminish it. You cannot have a politician come out or a journalist trying to combat the religious ideology of groups like ISIS. Unfortunately, however, when scholars do rebut the religious ideology of groups like ISIS, they are discredited in most of the time by politicians and media. For example, in one of his speeches, Abu Muhammad al-Adnani, the official spokesperson and a senior leader of ISIL, said, and these are some of the narratives that you hear from ISIL. These are the narratives that only well-versed scholars who are able to combat them. And therefore it makes sense to be working with them and empowering them, not humiliating them and discrediting them. And so one of the arguments, for example, of ISIL is that God bless Prophet Mohamad, they say, God bless him, who was sent with the sword as a mercy to all the worlds. Responding to this, in their letter to Baghdadi, a group of 127 leading scholars said, this statement comprises compounded confusions and a mistaken paradigm. Yet it is often repeated by followers of the Islamic State. Now God sent the Prophet Muhammad as a mercy to humanity. The Quran says, we did not send you except as a mercy to the worlds. This is true for all time and place. The Prophet was sent as a mercy to people, animals, plants, to the heavens, and to the subtle beings. No Muslims disagree about this. It is a general and unconditional statement taken from the Quran itself. However, the phrase used by ISIL, sent with the sword, is part of a hadith that is specific to a certain time and place which have since expired. Thus, it is forbidden to mix the Quran and hadith in this way. And it is forbidden to mix the general and specific and the conditional and the unconditional. Furthermore, groups such as ISIS propose, for instance, that it is acceptable to attack non-Muslims in the West, where non-Muslims can be taken to mean non-combatants, civilians, or in the terminology of Islamic jurisprudence, those who are not engaged in direct combat. Muslim jurists look at this and they say this violates a well-known principle in Islamic jurisprudence, and that is, it is not permissible to kill their women and children if they are not in direct combat. This juristic principle is based on the prophetic prohibition on soldiers from killing women and children, as is reported in an authentic sound narration in the hadith, where he said to them, I say to you, I give you 10 rules for your guidance in battlefield. Do not commit treachery or deviate from the right path. You must not mutilate dead bodies, neither kill a child, nor a woman, nor an aged man. Bring no harm to the trees, nor burn them with fire, especially those which are fruitful. Slay not any of the enemy's flock, save for your food. You are likely to pass by people who have devoted their lives to monastic services, Christians and Jews. Leave them alone. And commenting on this, the 13th century leading scholar, jurist, and a hadith master, Imam As-Subki, made it unequivocally clear what scholars have understood from this prohibition, in which the standard rule of engagement, and this is agreed upon by Sunni scholars, by Shiite scholars, that a Muslim soldier may not kill any woman or any child soldier unless they are in direct combat, and they can only be killed in self-defense. In fact, the nature of this prohibition, as far as Islamic jurisprudence is concerned, is so specific and well-defined that there can be no legal justification, nor can there be a legitimate excuse from an Islamic legal perspective for circumventing this convention of war by targeting non-combatants or civilians whatsoever, and that the Sharia ruling of killing them is not only prohibited, but also a major sin and contravenes one of the principal commandments of our way of life. There are many such propositions that groups like ISIL will put forward. There are many such propositions that young Australian Muslims may put forward in order to justify their anger. And it is only those who are well versed in the text and who are able to interpret it within the context who are able to rebut some of these ideologies. So it is not becoming, therefore, to have them slammed and slandered and defamed publicly, because it takes away the very issue of trust that we have heard about. It takes away this very issue of the channel of communication through which they can speak to those whom they trust. And there are so many principles within Islamic law that are taken for granted by Muslim scholars. It is agreed upon. But whenever we try to communicate that, whenever we try to say Islam doesn't say so, and we have the evidence to prove it, then of course that is rejected outright. Now, Islam is evidence-based. Anyone who comes and claims that they have an opinion about Islam, Muslim scholars would say to them, where is your evidence? Where is your evidence from the text, from the Quran and the Hadith and the statements of reliable scholars? Now, often we are asked, I am asked often by the media, why don't you speak out against ISIS or ISIL? And so, well, we do, but you're not listening. You're not listening. There are hundreds of fatwas that never make it to any newspaper, fatwas against ISIS and ISIL. But when one member of ISIL delivers a fatwa against Australians, it makes it on the front page of every newspaper. But when hundreds of Muslim scholars issue fatwas to the contrary, it doesn't make it anywhere. Now this brings me to the next question, and that is, there must be, if we are to move forward, there must be a shift in media and political rhetoric. We have to move beyond the negative rhetoric. And despite what we heard before, that both sides are to blame, I disagree, because yes, both sides have to be blamed. However, the disproportionate measures that are taken by media and politicians far outweigh the powers of the Muslim community. They far outweigh it. There needs to be a serious engagement, and in this case, the rhetoric of politicians and media must change. It must become more positive and inclusive if we are to move forward. This is what the young people tell us in the community. This is what the women tell us in the community. This is what the young people tell us in the community. They are traumatized big time by media reporting and political statements. Now, whether we want to accept that or not, that's beside the point, but the fact remains that they are traumatized. And I want to share with you a very quick story that just happened to me last week. I am a very sensitive man, and a very sensible man, and an optimist. And I like to engage. I'm never against this engagement. I want to give you just one story to illustrate our trauma. I was approached last week by a reputable TV station, a TV program, to take part in their documentary that went for 1 hour, so that they want to showcase, they said they wanted to showcase the positive, quiet, yet extraordinary work that the Australian Muslim community undertakes, so that the wider Australian community can see that there is much more to the Australian Muslim community than meets the eye. And initially I rejected. I said I will not be part of any TV program because I have been traumatized by their negative experiences. I have sued one of the national papers for defamation, not because I make outrageous statements, but simply because the journalist felt like he can do it. And took 2.5 years of my valuable time, which could have been invested elsewhere, to fight them, and I won eventually. Then this particular journalist, a reputable program. And I know many people in Sydney refused to engage with this program because, and in hindsight, they were correct. After hours of trying to convince me that of the noble intent of the program, I asked for an email, a written email to explain. And I have a written email, and this is what he says. We are very aware of the positive, engaging efforts underway within Muslim communities to encourage young people towards this end. But the wider Australian community often doesn't get to see these efforts. That is why we want to come to Brisbane to film yourself and the young people engage in your program. I have a program that I designed called Applied Islam, that it engages young Muslims, and we don't shy away from discussing the hot issues, but we give them critical thinking tools. We give them jurisprudential principles so they can discern and distinguish between what is the difference between a legitimate act of jihad and terrorism. This is how jurists look at this issue. And we equip our young people with this. And I told this journalist this. And I said, listen, I don't want to take part in your program because I don't want you to jeopardize this program for me. He says, I guarantee you I will not do that. And he sent me this letter. The aim is to show the quiet but extraordinary work you do to help young people and to showcase the fact that nurturing thought and reasonable debate is what we all need. The role of your young students in this would simply be to be themselves engaged with you in dynamic discussions about their humanity and identity. It sounds simple, he says, but we think this is a powerfully positive thing which Australians need to see. If you receive an email like this, I took this email to my students and I said, what do you think? Would you like to engage? Initially they said no, because they are traumatized. These are not radicalized young people. These are excellent young Muslims who are brilliant in their thinking. But they said, we will not be engaged. Nevertheless, the journalist came to my house with his team, ate in my house. I spent an hour with him, and then took him to my class. And he tried to convince this class of young students at a mosque that he is genuine in his intentions, and spent the next 50 minutes filming a most engaging and dynamic and thought-provoking discussion on jihad, on terrorism, and identity issues. And guess what happened? We featured for less than 10 seconds in the program, and not one of those students appeared. They all went to watch that program with excitement, and then they were totally disappointed. And I wrote to this journalist and I said, you have succeeded, if any, in enhancing the distrust and mistrust these young people have towards media and the authorities. So congratulations. We need to move beyond the negative rhetoric. We need to start using positive language. And there has been some, just to finish off, just 1 minute, please. Positive language and strength-based approach is necessary. Yes, we recognize there are young people who are vulnerable and who can be radicalized. And if we are part of the solution, then engage with us genuinely and honestly. And if it is not acceptable for somebody like the Grand Mufti to make a statement after the Paris bombings that seemed untimely because there was nothing wrong in the statement, then it is equally unacceptable for a politician to come out on TV and say Islam is the problem, further traumatizing an already traumatized and besieged community. If we are to move forward, let us... There needs to be a shift in the use of language when discussing the question of extremism. In a recent groundbreaking study to do with asylum seekers, but there is a lot of resemblance, the Asylum Seekers Resource Center commissioned a study examining the importance of language and messaging when discussing asylum seekers. Replace asylum seekers for fundamentalism, extremism, radicalization. And yesterday, Dr. Ingram spoke about this extremely well. It found that language is most effective in persuading the bulk of Australians to shift their ideas on people seeking asylum. It found that the job, and I like this very much, it found that the job of a good message is not to say what is popular, it is to make popular what needs to be said. The research found that changing the minds of the bulk of Australians relies on championing positive messages, and in the case of asylum seekers or radicalization, the championing of a number of principles. For example, they said seeking asylum is a fundamental human right. And equally, being an Australian Muslim gives them an entitlement of being citizens of this nation and should not be excluded. But as the discussion about domestic violence talks about all of us collectively being responsible and does not sideline a particular community equally, when we talk about radicalization, it must not be the Muslim community. This is a collective issue. It's a collective problem. And unless we look and examine at all the causes and begin to engage positively, genuinely, and honestly, I'm afraid we will not find a solution. Thank you for listening.
Radicalization, but also Islamophobia.